Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to kick off the conversation now. My name is Pete O'Neillia. I'm the general manager of Insider NJ, which is a political news source, and we're one of the co-sponsors of today's discussion with Dr. Harrison and former Governor Florio. So welcome to the second installment of the Salon series conversations, which is sponsored by the Political Science and Law Department here at Montclair State University. I'm also going to name the other sponsors of the event, and if you could just give a round of applause as I name them. The Montclair University, the College of the Arts, the School of Communication and Media, the Center for Student Involvement, the Political Science Club, the College Republicans, and the College Democrats here at Montclair State, as well as Insider NJ. And I believe this is the second of three conversations as part of this series. And the series is going to continue with other thought leaders and policymakers from throughout the region, which will continue into next semester. So now I'm going to introduce the host and the conversation leader, Dr. Brigid Callahan Harrison, who's a professor of political science and law here at Montclair State, where she teaches courses in American government. Dr. Harrison earned her BA from Stockton University, her MA from Rutgers, and her PhD from Temple University, and she's also a National Mensa Fellow. She's the author of 5 books on American politics and is a frequent commentator in the print and electronic media on national and New Jersey politics. So now I'll have Dr. Harrison come on out.
Thanks, Pete. I want to join Pete in thanking our sponsors for this event, including my colleagues, Dr. Hafizian and Professor Lazarus, who brought their classes today. Please allow me to introduce Governor Florio. James J. Florio was born in Brooklyn, New York on August 29, 1937. He attended local public schools and then, while serving in the U.S. Navy from 1955 to 58, took correspondence courses and received a high school equivalency diploma from the state of New Jersey. Florio received a BA from Trenton State College in 1962 and did graduate work at Columbia University before earning a JD from Rutgers University Law School in Camden in 1967. In 1969, Florio was elected to the New Jersey State Assembly and served 3 terms before being elected to Congress in 1974, where he would serve until his election as governor in 1989. As a member of the House of Representatives, Florio's considerable legacy included being the architect of the federal Superfund law and establishing the provisions that would allow for the creation of the Pinelands National Reserve. During his tenure as governor, Florio advocated for and signed into law the strongest ban on semi-assault weapons in the United States, attracting the ire of the National Rifle Association. Faced with an unanticipated $600 million budget deficit and a Supreme Court ruling mandating additional funding for public schools, Florio proposed to raise additional revenue to balance the budget, increase school aid, and provide property tax relief by increasing the sales tax and the income tax on high-income earners. Opposition to his policies spurred a tax revolt. In 1993, Governor Florio was defeated in a close general election by Republican Christine Todd Whitman, who won by a margin of 49 to 48%. Today, he remains the last New Jersey governor to make the state's full contribution to the public employee pension system. Please join me in welcoming Governor Florio. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So, before we begin, I want to tell you my Jim Florio story. And I will take you back to when I was a very young woman of about age 24, 25. And at that point in time, I was working on my master's degree at Rutgers University. And, pardon me, thank you. And in 1991, as a result of those policies that I described in our introduction, the Democrats lost control of the state legislature. And Governor Florio called a meeting of all the Democratic Party chairs. At the time, I was working on political campaigns, including one for state legislators who lost their election. And the party chairman for whom I was working, Joe Ginhart, was going out of town when this meeting was occurring. And so he asked me if I would go in his place. So I mentioned that I was about 24 years old, right? So I get to Drumthwacket, and I am obviously very young and female, and all of the party chairs are not. And I get to this very grand parlor where you had arranged, I guess, 23 chairs in a circle, and I walk into the room, and I'm nervous as anything. And this gentleman walks over to me, and he takes me by the arm, and he says, obviously I'm the weakest person in the room, and he says, "You come sit by me." And that in and of itself, though it is just a very kind of superficial but kind gesture, in my mind, represents the civility, the caring for the underdog, the not looking at, who do I have to please in this room, but what's the right thing to do, that really endeared him to my heart forever, because you remember those things. And obviously now, 25 years later, I remember them. Enough about me. This conversation is based on Governor Florio's book, which you can purchase today if you like. He will sign copies afterwards. If you are short on funds today, there also are brochures sitting outside at the table, and I think that there's a 30% discount coupon for sales. But the book is called Standing on Principle, Lessons Learned in Public Life. It is published by Rutgers University Press. So you left public office 25 years ago. In reading your book, I was struck by several things. One was how the latter days of your gubernatorial administration foreshadowed so much of what was to come politically, both in our state and in the nation. Secondly, I was struck by the consistency in terms of the policy issues that were important to you and that were important then and remain important today, including gun control, including the environment. But I wanted to ask you, what prompted you to write this book now?
Well, it's interesting. Since I left office in 1994, a number of people have asked me to write a book. And I really haven't had time. I've been doing a whole lot of things, like taking care of mortgages and things of that sort. But I ultimately decided that I was going to do it because I've had a lot of interesting life experiences. And I think things you can tell I've been around a long period of time. One of the few virtues of longevity is getting a perspective on things, being able to see how things change over the years. And they've changed dramatically over that relatively small period of time. And I have a number of life experiences that I wanted to be able to share with people, to give them my thoughts on how things are going and how things perhaps should go, things that we should be doing. And that's really what the book's about. It's working from the premise that we are the product of our life experiences, and that if you're into public policy, which I have been all of my life, my public life, my private life, I've been teaching at Rutgers for 20 years. So in academic life, all have been devoted to public policy. And if you feel strongly, as I do, about public policy really working in the public interest, you have to be concerned if things aren't going in the way they should be. So what I thought I would do was take, and the chapters the chapters represent things, different insights that I've gained. And what I would do is explain to people how the result of your policy views are shaped by your lifetime experiences. Your values, your principles are all very important, understanding things. And if you want to say, I want this to be achieved, you've got to really explain to people. I mean, that's the essence of democracy, is building a consensus. So communicating is extremely important, which you're all learning how to do very well, hopefully. But that's what the book is about. It represents different views that I've taken, different values that I had, and the correlation between values and policy. And I suggest a whole bunch of things to do in order to make sure that we have public policy made in the public interest, as opposed to public policy being made in private interest.
Well, let's talk about one of those policies. Your book starts off talking about one of the most important and successful battles waged in your gubernatorial administration, and that was the assault weapons ban that you signed into law. This issue is incredibly important to young people, people of this generation. They are it is the issue about which they are concerned the most, according to public opinion polls, and they tend to be cohesively in favor of gun control measures, sensible gun control measures. Can you start off telling us why that battle was so important to you and how you waged it?
Let me share with you the thought that I just shared with you a couple of minutes ago, that the book is designed to highlight values and approaches. The first chapter is the chapter about this issue, assault weapons. And that's the case because it represents a very important, if not the most important principle that I have contained in the book. And that is that if public policy is going to be made in the public interest, there are certain things that we have to do that perhaps we're not doing as well as we should be doing. First of all, we've got to get real people, average people, normal people, engaged and informed of the process. Engaged in the process because that's the way our system works. It's called participatory democracy, which is a fancy way of saying the system doesn't work unless we all work at making it work. And you have to have people informed because the problems are becoming more complex. We've got to be able to share information. We've got to be able to help people come to make decisions about the options that are available to them, about the alternatives that are available to them. Because really, is there one answer to a question, to a problem? There are multiple. Each have pluses and minuses. People have to know what the options are. You can't fix a problem if you don't understand the problem. There are no answers if you don't know what the questions are. So you really do have to become engaged. This is an example. It's one of the things I'm most proud of. 1989, it was really the first, my recollection, the first of the mass shootings that we've been experiencing much more frequently recently in a school, Stockton, California. Crazy man went to the schoolyard, started mowing down children. That highlighted this issue at that point. I got elected that year. I said, this is nuts. I mean, this is just something that makes no sense whatsoever. There's no need for these types of weapons that cause this problem, military assault weapons. There's no need to have these things. We shouldn't have them in New Jersey. And I came out and I pronounced that that was going to be a goal. I worked with the legislature, frankly had to harass the legislature a bit, but got the legislature to pass a ban saying that in New Jersey you can't have military assault weapons. You can't possess them, can't sell them, can't have them. They're banned. The gun lobby motivated themselves, and we motivated them to work very hard. They worked so hard that they really changed the legislature, elected a pro-gun legislature. They committed themselves to repealing the ban that we had on these weapons. They were successful in there. As governor, I had the opportunity to veto the repealer. So that's what I did. So the fight became whether they could override my veto. Technically, politically, as well as partisanly, they had the numbers. They had more than 2/3 majority in this group. Well, at that point, I made the decision that we were not going to take this down, laying down. We mounted a campaign. I see a few older people here who may very well remember this. In 1991, we mounted a campaign, and there was a campaign that was very powerful. We mobilized medical people. We had doctors come and testify about gun violence. We had a doctor from a Newark hospital came down and testified that the United States military sent their military surgeons to Newark, New Jersey to learn how to deal with gunshot wounds from these types of weapons. We had police officials who came mobilized. We had a police official from Camden testified that he would not allow policemen to go into North Camden, which was a tough neighborhood, because he said the bad guys had more firepower than the good guys did. We had teachers who testified about the influence and the outlook of people dealing with young children who were subjected to violence. We had a child was shot during this period of time up in Paterson, New Jersey. We had ministers who came in and testified to their congregations about how this was an issue that dealt with faith. It was something that had to be done. We had campaigns going to op-eds, op-ed pieces in the paper. We had editorial boards. We had press conferences. And in the space of about 45 days, we mobilized the people of the state. The vote occurred in the state Senate, the last vote, as to whether they would override my veto or not. I'm pleased to tell you, not a single member of the Senate, Democrat or Republican, voted to override the veto. We had mobilized the people of the state to such a degree that they were all intimidated to do that. It was New Jersey's finest hour, as far as I was concerned. And that was testimony to the whole idea that getting people, real people, engaged and informed, they can take on the most powerful lobbies, the NRA, the gun lobby, just flabbergasted. They couldn't figure out what happened to them. And what happened to them was democracy happened to them. And democracy is illustrated by that type of engagement and getting people informed on things. Let me just share with you an observation about what we're doing with you now. I've always worked from the premise that the American people, all American people, have certain traits, certain characteristics that are unique to America. And one of them is the fact that we don't stand for clear unlawfulness. We don't stand for unfairness. Things that are arbitrary and capricious, people will argue against and they'll mobilize against. Now, admittedly, we all have different ideas about what's unfair. But when consensus develops that something is unfair, American people rebel against that. I'll give you the best example recently is we all were concerned when we heard that the administration in Washington was adopting a policy to consciously deter immigrants from coming to this country. And the policy was that if you bring your children into this country, we're going to take your children away from you. And they did it. And for about 3 weeks, the American people would absorb this. And at the end of the 3 weeks, Democrats, Republicans, libertarians, anybody you could think of, said, this will not stand. Nobody should have their children taken away from them, whether they're an immigrant or not, whether they're whoever they are. And it got changed. It got changed. The policy is canceled now. I'm also optimistic about we're on the verge of having that same thing occur with regard to assault weapons and military gun control. I think it's important. All the things that are happening, the mass shootings, slowly but surely, the American people are saying, this is not something that can stand. This is arbitrary. This is unfair. This is bad for, there's no right to an Uzi. There's no right to AK-47s. So one of the things that we've done is to start to I had a program in Rutgers not too long ago where we had people come in from all walks of life talking about how we have to have, there's nothing unreasonable about being concerned that 40% of the people who have guns in this country never went through a check, a background check. There's nothing unreasonable about saying that somebody who now is on the terrorist list can't get on an airplane, but they can buy a gun. That's insane. I mean, there's nothing unreasonable about saying we spend taxpayers' money to provide for vests for our policemen. And then we authorize the sale of armor-piercing, cop-killer bullets. That makes no sense. So slowly but surely, as people become engaged, real people, engaged and informed, it's going to change.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about Angelo Arricchetti. He was your one-time mentor, and for the young people in the audience who aren't familiar with that name, if you watch the movie American Hustle, the character Carmine Polito, that was the main character portrayed by Jeremy Renner, was based on and you say quite accurately. On Angela Ericetti. You write about Ericetti, let me read just a little passage. I spent a lot of time with Ericetti in his office, and I saw how he operated, how he used his position to gather information, and then how he used that information, for better or worse, as an instrument of power. I would be sitting there when somebody would come in and tell him something. Then the next person would come in and he would share the information he had just learned with that person. But he would do it in a way that intimated that he was the source rather than the recent recipient of the information. I marveled at how effectively he used this technique of gathering and dispensing information to achieve and hold political power, to be the central figure of authority, the hub that connected and held together all the spokes of the wheel. What other lessons did Ericetti teach you? I mean, this was a tough time. This was really, and some would say, the height of boss politics in New Jersey.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, this raises a number of interesting issues. I mean, one issue is the fact that over this period of time that I've talked about, that I've been involved. I was first elected in 1969. Over this period of time, I've gone through 4 stages of political development. The first was the traditional old machine. If any of you have read the novel The Last Hurrah, which talked about Boss Curly, it's the old machine politician. I'm a product of that. As a student, I was a law student, I moved to Camden, New Jersey. And there I reached out to the local mayor at the time. I said, I'm a young man, I've got some graduate work that I just finished. I'm going to law school pretty soon, and I want to become involved in politics. And in those days, you had a ward leader, you had district leaders, you had people who were part of the local political machine. And they sent the ward leader around to see me. And they said, you look like a nice kid, you're interested, you seem to be fairly articulate. We're going to make you a district leader. So I became a district leader in the ward, which meant I had 600 people under my jurisdiction. No real authority, but perceived authority. And my job was to make sure if somebody had a complaint in the neighborhood, they'd come to me. I would then go to the local people in the government, fix this hydrant or whatever the problem was. And you build up a little stature. And so when elections come around, I go knock on their door, say, come vote for Joe Blow. You help me do this, fine, I'll vote. That's a traditional old-fashioned machine. That was coming to an end when I first moved to Camden. And so I was part of that process, got some grounding in it, understood the limitations, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But then the next stage is what I call the McGovern stage. 1968, Senator McGovern ran for president, and he redid the Democratic Party. The characteristic of this period of time was volunteers, not having paid political workers, as the old machines did, but trying to appeal to people on the basis of ideals, issues, put together organizations where people would become very much enthusiastic about somebody or something. And the telephone was the key here. You'd make telephone calls to people, and you'd evaluate them, 1, 2, 3, or 4, whether they were strong supporters or not. And then you'd go back and get them later on. And that was my coming of age stage. And I built my own little machine with people who were volunteers. I was the chairman at that point of the Camden County Young Democrats. And I built that into an organization that developed. After that came the stage that I call the high visibility consultant stage. James Carville is a name you may have heard of. There are a number. Lee Atwater was a Republican counterpart. Ed Rollins. These are people who came in. They were given the campaigns. Money had to be raised, so money became a big factor. And they were high visibility thematic people. They would come, and you remember that Carville thing was, it's the economy, stupid. He built this whole campaign around that. And it was an interesting period of time, interesting people. Yeah. The next stage is the one we're probably in right now, which is low visibility consultants. People you don't even know about, who are out there accumulating data, segmenting people into groups, and running campaigns at much more astronomically expensive rates. So we've gone through this period of time it's an interesting progression if you think about it. And there are pluses and minuses to anything, all of them. Going back to Eric Heddy, he was the boss. He was the mayor, the state senator, the county chairman, the representative to the state Democratic Party, and he was very intelligent, very smart, very wily, a little thuggish, a little crude, but very smart. Manipulated people in a true Machiavellian fashion. And I learned a lot of things from him. That's a good example in the book, sitting in his office, listening to him. We parted ways later on, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But one of the things that gave me a good sense that this is not a place I wanted to stay was in his office one day when he has the police chief on the phone. He's giving the police chief the names of the people that he doesn't like, that he wants to have staked out. I'm saying to myself, this is not a longevity play. This is something you want to get out of here as soon as you can. Then later on, they came to me and they wanted me to support somebody that I didn't like and didn't think was a good person. And they told me I had to support him. By this time, I'm a congressman, two-term congressman. And the boss said, you've got to support this guy or we're going to throw you off the ticket.
That was Dick Leone running against
Dick
Bill
Leone,
Bradley. Right.
Bill Bradley. And I just said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to support him. Throw me off the ticket if you want. I'll run my own ticket. And when I made serious moves in that direction, they said, no, they were going to throw me off the ticket, but they wouldn't run anybody against me. And I got elected. And the next year, Eric Heddy, by the way, went to jail. The next year, I took on the organization and carried the whole organization. So I had a whole bunch of new people came in and a new approach to things. But that was Eric Heddy. And it's sad. And it's a good example, though, of someone who is smart, clever, whatever, but falls prey to a problem many politicians do. They believe their own clippings, and they listen to only people that tell them nice things. That's a bad problem. And he fell into that trap, heads down. So it's something that I've learned lots from people that I've worked with. And hopefully you all will keep your ears open and listen a lot and read a lot. I mean, Eric Heddy is a good example of someone I interacted with. There are other people I've interacted with as well. But I've also read about people. One of the things I did was consciously adopt the style of administration that I read when I read, I forget the name of the author. Who's the historian for President Roosevelt?
Doris Kearns Goodwin?
No. Anyway, there's a 3-volume edition of President Schlesinger, Arthur Schlesinger. And he details Roosevelt's style of management, which I adopted and it worked very well for me as well. Give the same task to multiple people. They go crazy about it when they find out about it. But it gives me opportunities to get different views rather than be reliant upon one source of information. Roosevelt did it with great success. Had the same job given to people, they'd come back, give them 3 different views or 4 different views. Another person I emulate, which I hope you won't take badly, I read a biography of Joseph Stalin when I was in college. And I always remembered that he did something that I ultimately emulated. Take jobs that nobody else wants. Volunteer for tasks that nobody else wants. You're no threat to anybody. You have the opportunity to work in the shadows. Stalin started out robbing banks for the party. And then, when he became with a little more stature, he took on clerical jobs that nobody wanted. And he just accumulated files and things. He couldn't compete with the intellect of Trotsky or the intellect of Stalin. But one day they woke up and he was in charge. And there's something to be said for doing things under the radar, listening a lot, and volunteering for jobs nobody else wants. Gives you the ability to accumulate knowledge, and knowledge is power.
So thinking about I would argue that we still have some forms of political machines today. perhaps in South Jersey, perhaps in Essex County and Hudson County. How did the machine back then differ from what we see boots on the ground today?
Dramatically different, dramatically different. First of all, the machine we have today is nothing comparable to what was then existed.
In terms of power?
In power, the ability to influence, the ability to coerce. Money is a very important factor. The machines that existed when I was in the legislature. When I was in the legislature, if you wanted to ensure that something happened in the legislature, if you could get 9 people, 9 specific people, who were the chairman of 9 of the powerful committees of counties, you'd get anything in the world done. I remember there was a fellow, David Friedland, who he went to jail as well. He was a member of the legislature, but a very smart guy as well. He got up and testified on behalf of a bill in the state assembly, and he went on for about 40 minutes talking about the. He apparently went back to his desk, got a telephone call from the county chairman in his county, came back, got the floor, and said, "I just gave you all the reasons why that bill shouldn't be passed. It's not a good bill. It's a bad bill, and here are the reasons why it should be passed." He got a phone call. So the fact of the matter was, those people were powerful. Here, what you have is the power to deal with primaries. That's really the power that local organizations have now. And the difference is that now the organizations as such are not dominated and totally populated by people that are on payrolls. It used to be people were on payrolls. It's your living, you'll do what you're told. Now, it's much more broad-based, and people are affiliated with organizations for a whole bunch of reasons. Their livelihoods don't depend on it. Therefore, the coercive capability of people is diminished, welcomely so.
So as I was reading your book, I started a chart tracking which elections that you ran in. And at one point, I think I counted that you had run for office 4 times in 4 years, successfully for the state assembly and then unsuccessfully for the House. Then you would run for governor twice before winning the 3rd time. So what were the lessons that you learned that enabled you both not to get discouraged and continue pursuing the office that you had set your eyes on, but also to forge ahead and do so and be able to succeed?
The most important lesson I learned was when they have landslide elections, it is best to be on the right side of the landslide. I've been on landslide elections. The first election I ran in was Governor Cahill. He was a very popular Republican from my county, and he ran on a statewide basis, won in an overwhelming landslide. I ran in a district that was supposed to be a Democratic district. Everybody knew it was going to be a bad one, going to be a bad year, so nobody wanted to run. So they took this kid who had just graduated from law school and allowed him to run because we expected him to lose. I won by 360 votes out of a whole bunch of cast. I was one of 2 assemblymen south of Trenton who were Democrats that year. It was a wipeout year. I ran in the Nixon-McGovern year. It's a landslide year. I ran for Congress on the wrong side of a landslide, but I lost by a very small margin, and therefore I ran the next time. And that year I ran in the Watergate year, which was a Democratic landslide. So I've had this situation where I won for governor in a landslide that I created, and then I lost for governor in a landslide, not a landslide, in a small margin that I was on the wrong side of. So the thing I learned really in a serious vein is that you can actually learn as much from losing as you can from winning. It's obviously preferable to win, but there are things to be gained from losing, taking out of the experience. As a matter of fact, in the book, I write the story of my first loss for Congress when I lost in 1972. I lost by a very small margin in a rock-ribbed Republican district at that period of time. And as I said, Nixon won by huge amounts everywhere. That night, I'm in the headquarters where we got the word that I lost. My 3 children, who at that point were like 12, 10, and 9, were there. And on the way home, my daughter was crying. She was the youngest. I said, don't cry. I mean, you take from these experiences, you learn, you correct, and you go back. And they always remembered that because the next time I ran for Congress, I won. They all talk about how we all cheered. I said, well, what we actually did go learn what it is we did to screw up the first time around. Nixon helped a lot. But the fact of the matter is we did do things differently the second time around. I campaigned in a different way. I worked to develop themes as opposed to doing retail. A whole lot of things we did. And that's a good lesson as well. I mean, all your experiences leave you something. Sometimes they leave you pain, but the pain gives you some understanding of what it is to avoid, what you can do better. So learning from losses is something that's very good lessons.
Important. Earlier, so in the first campaign in which you ran to succeed Governor Byrne, I guess that would have been 1981. Yes. In your book, you mentioned that you lost that election by only
1,797 is a number that sticks in my mind.
I knew that he would remember that number. And part of the context of that was that there were allegations of voter suppression, particularly in the cities. And then again in 1993, when you lose, this time to Governor Whitman, Ed Rollins is the campaign manager, and he makes a remark that the Republicans had succeeded in suppressing the votes, particularly using black ministers. In light of what we see this election year, looking at allegations of voter suppression, first off, do you chalk up those efforts for your two losses? And secondly, how do you think we can best combat those efforts?
Well, I don't bother analyzing why the losses occurred, and so it's over. But the first one, by the way, is something that was not disputed. A court order after the election, because what was done was the National Republican Organization put in people in the state. They hired part-time policemen, off-duty policemen, whatever, and stationed them around minority polling places with armbands called Ballot Security Task Force, signs being posted about how you can go to jail if you inappropriately vote and things of that sort. And they did it just in Newark, Camden, all of the areas where they had minorities. So there was a lawsuit after the election was over. The lawsuit resulted in an order forbidding them to take any action. That I think it's still in order. It's still in effect at this point. So that's beyond dispute. The Rollins experience was interesting because he, after the election, bragged to people, and to including the press, that he had taken care of the election by paying ministers and other people, leaders in the black community, to not vote and to discourage the vote. Then when someone pointed out to him that's a crime, he then changed his mind, called before the grand jury, testified under oath that he was a liar, which is kind of interesting, a way of putting things. And so you take your choice as to what you believe. But I mean, the way you deal with that problem is with every other problem, is transparency. Letting the light of day shine on the efforts to close polls. I forget which, Kansas, I think it was. One of the cities in Kansas, they closed the poll and wouldn't allow people in the town to vote in the town. They had to go someplace else, a minority community. So, I mean, letting people know, because people inherently are good. People inherently will vote public interest, but they'll also vote the self-interest. The problem for leaders, or the task for leaders, is to try to show people that their self-interest really is the public interest, and that all of our interests are collegial. We're all in these things together. And so saying, okay, you don't like property tax, you don't like gasoline tax, but do you like bridges falling down? Do you like tunnels collapsing? So life is choices. And if, in fact, you expand everyone's self-interest, which is legitimate, to a broader sense, of an expansive sense of what self-interest is, as really being the public interest, is something. Let me share with you a way of highlighting this. I have wisdom from a rabbi who I know who's very smart. And he said to me, he said, you know, Governor, Jewish people have a reputation for being very philanthropically generous. And he says, I like to think we are out of goodness of our heart. But we also have brains. We understand that, in fact, when things get chaotic, when things get unstable, people who are harmed by the instability look for reasons as to why they're being harmed. They think they're doing well, they're working hard, but they don't get ahead. And when they look for reasons, there always seems to be somebody who's willing to give them the reason. Tell them who it is that's causing them the problem, what it is that's causing them the problem. And sometimes it seems that my people seem to be the people who are pointed to. Therefore, it's in my self-interest, as it is in everyone's self-interest, to try to have certain degrees of stability so that no one becomes so unhappy that they start looking for scapegoats. And that's still the case right now. I mean, in the old days, it used to be the Jews or the Catholics or the Irish. Now it's immigrants, Mexicans in particular, gays, Muslims. So the human nature doesn't change that much. So there's something to be said for the fact that the public interest is collectively all of our interests. And therefore, when somebody's doing so badly that they have to snap out, that's the cause for the Tea Party. That's the cause for all these movements that are happening, disaffected people. So keep in mind to think about not only your own narrowest self-interest, but what is really your real interest, which is our interest.
So in addition to those parallels between the past and isolating various groups, there are a couple of names that you mentioned, particularly in 1989. So now you're running for governor, and we start seeing, particularly on Jim Courter's campaign, a couple of individuals with some very contemporary references. So Roger Ailes had worked on Mike Dukakis's campaign, comes on to work for Jim Courter. And then Jim Courter faces a bunch of staff members leaving his campaign. And you write, primarily this was because many of them had been charged with influence peddling or were alleged to have peddled influence. The investors who purchased the property, this is a Cumberland County rehabilitation property. Investors purchased the property included Paul Manafort, a partner along with Roger Stone in the Washington consulting firm of Black, Manafort, Stone, and Kelly. In addition to owning part of Seabrook Farms property, Manafort was paid a fee of $326,000, $1,000 per housing unit for arranging the HUD grant. Manafort subsequently admitted to a congressional subcommittee that the way the deal was struck could be characterized as influence peddling. Shortly thereafter, Stone and Stevens resigned as political consultants to the Courter campaign. I'm wondering if in addition to kind of the changes that you alluded to in the beginning of your talks, that we're seeing the importance of individuals who view politics as an opportunity on both sides of the aisle to kind of foment division rather than looking after that public interest that you had described.
And some things never change. I mean, these same people doing what they're doing then, they're doing it now as well. So, yeah, the answer is that's the case. There are people whose motivations in politics are not as high as they could be. And transparency, again, is the answer, is to try to deal with those types of things.
So you're elected governor, and you are faced with a $600 million unanticipated budget deficit. It comes to pass that you need to create policies to deal with this, and you seek a 1 cent increase in the sales tax, an expansion in what is taxed, the famous toilet paper tax, a more graduated income tax and increased taxes for higher income earners over $70,000. And you also are implementing the Quality Education Act, the QEA. This generates lots of different pockets of resistance, right? Can you talk a little bit about that and what the net impact of that was?
Well, I guess the moral of the story is that if you feel strongly about something and you feel there's a need for integrity in the process, you've got to make hard decisions. I mean, one of the things that's most troubling to me over the last 20 or 30 years is how we have adopted into our psyche the view that was first articulated by President Reagan, that government is not the solution, government is the problem. We now all have incorporated into our meaning our thought that government somehow is bad. That's really silly. Government is not inherently good. It's not inherently bad. It's a tool. It's a tool which, in the hands of competent people of good faith, can do a lot of good things. And to be effective, government has to be honest. You can lie for a while, but ultimately it'll catch up with you. And you have to have some degree of understanding that nothing is for nothing. We all know that in our lives. You get what you pay for. And when I came into office, there were serious problems. In the middle of the year, because you come into office in January, the fiscal year ends at the end of June. So in that 6-month period, you have a responsibility to balance the budget under the Constitution. I came into office, there was a $600 billion shortfall in the middle of the year that we were in, and I had to prepare a budget for an anticipated shortfall of about $2 billion for the next year coming up. So we had to go do something, and the only thing we had to do were unpopular things. We had to make cuts. We cut agricultural subsidies. We did a whole bunch of things. The arts people were very unhappy. But I explained to them, I said, if you don't like what I'm doing, tell me what you'd prefer. Likewise, we did the cuts. That wasn't sufficient. So we had to raise money. We raised the money. The income tax was raised on the top 17% of the people in the state. So 83% of the people never paid a single penny. But the craziness of the time was such that everyone felt they were being oppressed. It's interesting, there was a group called Hands Across New Jersey, which was the counterpart of the Tea Party. They came and they were protesting and doing a whole bunch of things. I said, tell me what you'd like to do, and they didn't have anything to say. But I said, I want you to come to my office. I called the officers of the group, come to my office. They came to my office. I said, tell me what your problems are. So we don't like what you're doing. I said, well, okay. What don't you like? How many of you make more than, I think it was $83,000 a year? Because that was, anybody below that, and those were different numbers in those days, below that didn't pay anything. I said, how many people make more than they all chuckled. None of them made $83,000. Well, you're not paying anything. How many of you got the homestead rebate of $400 that we put into the package? They all raised their hand. They all got the $400. Then I said, how many of you got $350,000 back from the repeal of the automobile insurance thing, JUA, Joint Underwriting Association, was a surcharge that we took off of them. They all raised their hand. I said, what the hell are you doing here? You're the people we did this for. And one guy says, well, I want to be a millionaire someday, and I don't like taxes. So it was not the most logical, rational discussion, but it illustrated how sometimes we don't want to take responsibility for things. But it comes with the territory. I mean, you've got to be in a position to do things. And in the end, what we did was the right thing to do. After I left office, the taxes were cut. The income tax was cut. And it was a big number. Big number, when you cut taxes, revenues don't come in. If revenues don't come in, you've got to make more reductions. If you don't want to make those reductions, what are you going to do? Well, what they did was said, we're going to stop making payments into the state pension plan. From that day to this, the state pension plan has not been fully funded. I was the last governor to fully fund the pension plan. The pension plan now is in deficit by about $60 billion over that period of time. You folks are going to have to deal with that. mean, when I say nothing's for nothing, nothing's for nothing. You pay one end or you pay the other end.
So in 2000, you again tossed your hat into the ring, running against a political novice by the name of John Corzine for the nomination for the U.S. Senate, the Democratic nomination for the U.S. Senate. Corzine spends $35 million of his own money, or $151.41 for each of the 251,216 votes he received, while you, not having, I'm assuming, $35 million to dump in a Senate primary, spent $2.5 million, abiding by the state's campaign finance laws, or $13.89 for the 182,212 votes you received. This wasn't the first time this had happened. A similar scenario emerged when Frank Lautenberg won the Democratic nomination for Senate. And in the 2017 gubernatorial election, Phil Murphy essentially did the same thing, clearing the primary field by investing about $32 million.
Corzine did something different, unique, because there had been millionaires who had run before. There was a Huffington in California, the Lauder, the perfume people in New York. But they did it not in the way that
Corzine.
He did. And he's a friend, by the way. I mean, he's a good man. There's not a problem that I have with him. But what he did for the first time on millionaires running, he did it a clever way. He bought the organizations. He didn't just spend his money on TV. He went to the leader in Bergen County, leader in key counties, and said, I'm running. I'd like your support. I'd like to give you $5 million for your organization. They said, yes, thank you. You have our support. I mean, fairly transactional openness. But that is what's happened now. And now, so nobody with money doesn't go waste their money exclusively on television. It's spent much more cost-effectively and productively by going right to the organization and getting support.
Which is what Phil Murphy did in 2017. Yeah. I mean, what do you think about that? I mean,
I think it's a terrible system.
Well,
but I'm not sure I know what the alternative is, because I've been advocating public financing for years. It's not going to happen, which prompts me to come back to say the only way I can conceive of getting people back in and having public policy determined on the basis of the public interest is to get people engaged and informed, as I said before. And the gun example in New Jersey is an example of clearly we were outgunned in terms of money and in terms of influence. So if I'm convinced that even in 1989 or 90, when I was running with the problems, if I could have all 9 million people in New Jersey in a stadium and talk to them, explain to them why it is I was doing what I was doing, and it sounded rational to people. You could get, because I used to have town meetings, and people would come out. They were not happy about the taxes. But when I got done explaining why and what the reasoning was, people would say, well, I don't like it, but he's not crazy. He's fairly logical, and it makes some sense. You can bring people back, even when they're not enthusiastic about what you're doing. So I've always worked with the assumption that people's self-interest can be explained in a way to have it bigger than themselves. And most people of good faith, and most people have good faith, who are not ideologically driven or crazy, will see the other side of issues.
I think we have time for a few questions from the audience. Are there questions for Governor Florio? Yes. There's a gentleman with a mic next to you.
Governor, do you regret running for governor at all? Would you have rather perhaps have run for the Senate in 1978 instead, when Bill Bradley beat Jeffrey Bell?
No, I don't regret it. I mean, there's a big difference, though. That's a good question to raise another point. Good question between the difference between governor and an executive position and the Congress or an assembly and a legislative position. As governor, you have more authority, but you have authority to be superficial as well in a greater amount, you have a greater scope of authority, but you don't get down into the details. You've got to rely upon good staff, and I had good staff. I was fortunate. As a legislator, particularly as a congressman, your authority is the committee you're on. I happen to be chairman of a committee, an important committee, and dealing with environmental matters, transportation matters, and in that capacity, you can get down into and knowing more than anybody else in the room. I always took pride in getting things done in Washington, in Congress, because I knew more than anybody else in the room, whether it was environmental issues. People told me I couldn't get the pinelands preserved. 20% of New Jersey today is protected. Fragile areas, the water systems for South Jersey are protected as a result of my getting a bill through the Congress designated the pinelands, which I said 20% of New Jersey as a federal preserve. That's heavy, and that's getting something done because you're involved in details and control of the facts. So there's a difference between the two.
Yes, sir.
Yes. I think she worked with Governor McGreevey at the time that she did that for the model that the guns don't work except for individuals.
Right.
But she was there when I was there as well. She was in the assembly when I was there. She's a wonderful woman, very dedicated person, very hardworking person, and I'm really proud of what she's doing now. I mean, from her vantage point as the assistant leader in the Senate, she's a deputy, a very good person. Let me tell you what's happened with the NRA. This will astound you. My biggest contribution when I first ran for the state legislature was, I think, $100 or $200, something like that. And it came from the NRA. They liked me because in those days, the NRA isn't what it is today. The NRA was conservationists. A lot of people, they liked me because I had an environmental record, keeping open spaces so they could go hunt and do things like that. There was something called the Square Circle Gun Club in Camden County, New Jersey. They used to have picnics they would invite me to. I'd go speak to them. But what's happened since that time, the NRA has changed. It's changed now. The NRA now is a front group for gun manufacturers and gun dealers. The vast majority of members, real members of the NRA, they have no problem with gun checks, with background checks, things of that sort. But that's not who's dominating. So it has changed.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. There you go.
More so a comment / question, more so of how politicians can choose to ignore certain issues. I recall you saying in 1989, the shooting in California kind of prompted you to want to ban semi-automatic weapons. That same year in Louisville, there was a shooting at a paper company, which I actually just mentioned in class today, that guy went in, semi-automatic guns, a couple other things, killed 8 people, injured 20. And the next year, Mitch McConnell ran for mayor and didn't mention it not one time. And today still is one of the main people against this mental health check. Now, the guy that went into this post office or paper company was on Prozac, had suffered from manic depression. And you would think somebody who just ran for mayor in that same town would kind of have a personal tie to want to fix this problem. How can politicians continue to just ignore things and omit things? And it's kind of the same as lying, in my opinion. Certain politicians, because obviously you're not one of them.
You're not asking me to justify.
No, not justify. Just how do you feel? Like, what is your stance on something like that?
Which bill is that you're talking about?
Bill? No, I said Mitch McConnell and among other supporters of NRI are against the mental health check, like you just mentioned. But in a town that he ran for mayor a year after a mass shooting, dealing with someone who needed a mental health check, who was hospitalized for mental health problems, you know.
Clearly a degree of insensitivity that leaves a lot to be desired. And he's sort of demonstrated that straight on through, so nothing new, and nobody should be surprised.
Thank you.
I don't mind staying. I mean,
Sure, why don't we,
anybody has to leave. I mean, don't feel free to leave.
I actually had the honor of working on your 2000 campaign for Senate against John Corzine. It's a pleasure to see you again. So a former presidential candidate was recently quoted as saying that the media's intensive, obsessive scrutiny of candidates' private, personal lives has changed the way that a candidate's character is perceived and defined. The candidate who said that was Gary Hart. I wonder how you feel about that. Is there any truth to this statement, and what do you feel about the media's role in politics today?
Well, the media clearly has become intrusive, but I mean, drawing the line as to where it's intrusive. If I have the choice between having a media that's too intrusive or media that's not intrusive enough, I'll take not intrusive enough. I mean, I think we now are coming to appreciate the fact of the value of the media. I mean, I'm troubled, and I won't even go into Washington. I mean, the things that are happening in Washington, undermining institutions, including the media, are extremely troubling and should be troubling to everyone. The media can be a pain in the neck, but the fact of the matter is they provide a very important public service. Now, when we have a media that's cut out, we have a Congress that's inert in terms of the executive branch. That's troubling, more troubling than an intrusive media.
interesting.
Absolutely not. Most of the things, I mean, this sounds a little bit arrogant, but I did a lot of good things in Washington. I mean, I have a fairly good record. And everything I did with my partner on the Republican side in my committee. A fellow named Ed Madigan, there was a fellow from Long Island, Norm Lent. Two Republicans collaborated with me on everything that I did. And my whole legislative approach is to say, what are the points of commonality? Grope for those things first. Find out what we have in common. Then we'll argue later on about the things that we're going to argue about. But don't start out calling you a jackass. I mean, you start calling somebody names and you don't talk with someone. That's just insane. The whole democratic process is about forming a consensus among divergent views. The only way to do that is to talk to each other, find out what it is you have in common, and work together. If you don't do that, the polarization that's taking place in this country is unhealthy. It's unhealthy, but it's understandable in some respects. We have worked from a situation, all societies, including our own, have divergencies. There are cleavages. One that's always there is people who are satisfied and people who are not satisfied. The people who are satisfied are generally people who are doing reasonably well. The people who are not satisfied are people who are aspiring to do better. The safety valve that stops the tension from getting violent in this country has been the whole concept of upward mobility. I mean, I'm a classic example. I'm a high school dropout who joined the Navy, got my GED diploma in the service, went to Trenton State College because tuition was $150 a semester. I got $70 from the government in the form of the GI Bill, of Korean War GI Bill. Upward mobility is my middle name. And this is what this country's about. Now, as you folks all know, higher education is as an aspect of upward mobility. When I was the governor, New Jersey paid 70% of the cost of higher education. The schools paid the balance, tuition largely. Now it's reversed. The state pays 25%, I think.
2%.
And the school has to pay the rest. I mean, education, preschool education. There's nothing you can get educators to agree on except the fact that preschool education is very important to maximize the opportunity for kids to be all that they could be, to move up the scale. We don't pay for preschool education for all of our students in New Jersey. We're starting to move that way, and that's good. But there's bunches of things that have changed to cut off the perception that people can move up if they work hard and get ahead. And when that happens, people get discouraged. When they get discouraged, they get shrill. They start yelling. They can't move. They're stuck in the spot. When they do that, the people with resources, they become reactive. They become difficult to deal with. And it just becomes that much more difficult. There's a wonderful book by John Kenneth Galbraith called The Culture of Contentment. And the premise of the book is that in the 50% election turnout, and we're lucky if we get that, 26% becomes a majority, which means 74% of the people are out of the process. They become unhappy. So there's something to be said for the whole idea that the answer to all of our problems, most of our problems, restore some degree of civility, is to create the situation for upward mobility so that anybody who wants to and has the talent and the energy can get as far as they can. If you don't do that and you have this divergence that we have now of wealth and income so difficult, so different, that people give up hope, they become violent and difficult.
And one last question. Okay, so.
My friend Richie, he asked a question asking about partisanship at a 70s and 80s when you're talking about. I was curious if you go back further and if you would compare it to when we have a party structure, if you think the level of partisanship compares more to that or if not at all.
It's really beyond partisanship. It's your values, your principles, and your attitudes towards things. I mean, that's the difficult at this point. One of the things we need more than anything else is intellectual courage. By that I mean not just physical courage, but intellectual courage. A willingness to question. A willingness particularly to question traditional wisdom, which is more and more about tradition and less about wisdom. And that's not an easy thing to do. To question the way things are being done, even when they're colossally wrong and they're not working very well. Of course, there's always somebody that's going to be justifying things that are unjustifiable, usually because they're making money off of it. I mean, think tobacco. Now, think coal. You know, there's always going to be somebody that comes in and argues that. And somebody's got to stand up, and I can tell you authoritatively, it's not for the faint-hearted to question the status quo. And yet that's really more than anything else, because what we're doing nowadays, change is occurring so rapidly. The change is facilitating the non-ability to change policy. Change is occurring in a way that's outpacing our ability to formulate policies to deal with the consequences of the changes. So we're behind the curve. Yeah. It's like going to the toolbox, picking out the wrong tool. It's not going to work. You're going to be frustrated. You're going to be very unhappy. What we're doing is applying old policies to new problems. I'll give you a good example. The 2008 Great Recession. We should not have been surprised about that. The Great Recession was applying laws that were created in the 30s, the Great Depression. Those laws don't know anything about credit default swaps, interest rate swaps, other exotic derivative products. That's how that didn't work. That's what we're doing in area after area after area. You pick the sector: healthcare, energy, telecommunications, financial services. We're not having incremental change. We're not experiencing marginal change. We're having systemic change. We're having transformational change. And those changes are not being addressed. And until we start making the changes in our policies to address the real problems, we're just going to continue to be flailing. And that's what the problem is. And again, getting people to go out and talk about the problems. Because if you talk about the problem, someone can say, well, that's the problem, that's the interesting problem. What are you going to do about it? Then you've got to go take on a tough problem. But somebody's got to have the character, the spine, to say, this is the problem. My answer to the problem is this. If you don't like it, tell me what your answer is, and engage. Come back to engage and inform. That's the thing that has to be done, I think, it seems to me.
Governor Florio, I just want to thank you for sharing the accumulation of your wisdom with our students and with the general public. I know that my students learned a lot, and hopefully will bring your lessons that you're teaching them into the public arena. And we greatly appreciate it. And I want to remind you, first off, that this is the second in an ongoing series of conversations that we are having with influential leaders in the state and region. The next one will be in February. You'll get an email if you replied to this event. And also, Governor Florio will be signing copies of his book outside this room right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your patience.